showing some authority. Was he right to do it? And Sir Stephen Lovegrove, UK's national security advisor, warned that an accidental nuclear war with China is a growing risk. We'll be talking to a military expert to see whether this is a real possibility or slightly alarmist. And as always, we want you to get in touch. You know the email address by now, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or indeed tweet me at gbnews. All that and so much more between now and 4. But first, at the top of the hour, the very latest news headlines.
Darren, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 3. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. A man's been sentenced to life in prison in a historic sentencing which was broadcast live on television for the very first time. Judge Sarah Munro QC's comments were streamed from the Old Bailey. She handed Ben Oliver a life sentence after he pleaded guilty to killing his grandfather.
The sentence I pass upon you is therefore one of life imprisonment with a minimum term of 10 years and 8 months. From that term will be deducted the term you have spent on remand, which is 553 days. That deduction results in a term of 9 years and 63 days.
The battle for the keys to number 10 hots up tonight as the leadership candidates go head-to-head in Leeds. Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss are taking part in the first of 12 Tory hustings. Tax and spending are expected to be the big battlegrounds as they tour the country, hoping to secure party members' votes ahead of the ballot closing on September the 2nd. Speaking in Leeds, Liz Truss insists if she becomes Prime Minister, she'll help with the cost of people's energy bills.
I understand that families are really struggling at this time. We've seen a rise in global energy prices. That's why I would reverse the national insurance increase, putting more money back into people's pockets, but also have a temporary moratorium on the green levy to cut people's energy bills.
The NHS is closing its only gender identity clinic for children and young people and replacing it with a regional network. It's after it was told that only having one provider is not a safe or viable long-term option. The contract for the Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust will be brought to a close. Sir Keir Starmer says frontbencher Sam Tarry was sacked from the Shadow Cabinet because he booked media appearances without permission and made up policy on the hoof. It's after the Shadow Transport Minister defied Sir Keir's ban on joining the picket line with striking rail workers. Train services are still disrupted today after yesterday's strike caused travel chaos. Unions have announced a further strike this Saturday and on August the 13th. Sir Keir Starmer says trade unions will always be part of the Labour movement.
I think it's quite right for trade unions to stick up for their members and to fight for their members. Of course it is. And it's their members who are really struggling under this cost of living crisis. So, of course, trade unions are right to stick up for support and negotiate on behalf of their members. And I'm fully supportive of that and working with our trade unions.
Meanwhile, workers at Britain's biggest and busiest container port have also voted to strike in a dispute over pay. Members of the Unite Union backed industrial action at Felixstowe in Suffolk by 9-1. The union says an offer of a 5% pay rise is an effective wage cut because of the soaring rate of inflation. The gang leader who smuggled over £100 million in dirty money out of the UK has been jailed for more than 9 years. In the biggest money laundering case of its kind, Abdullah Al-Falassi flew suitcases stuffed with cash to Dubai between April 2019 and December 2020. His mules carried up to £500,000 in each suitcase, alongside coffee and air fresheners to put sniffer dogs off the scent. It was part of a service the gang offered to launder money for dozens of drug dealers across the UK. The US economy shrank again in the last 3 months, raising fears of an approaching recession. The Commerce Department in America announced today gross domestic product decreased at an annual rate of 0.9% in the second quarter, after falling at an annual rate of 1.6% in the first 3 months. A former Russian state journalist has been found guilty of discrediting the country's armed forces. Marina Ovsyannikova rose to prominence when she denounced the Russian invasion of Ukraine on state television. She was fined for the offence and was in court allegedly for asserting the illegitimacy of the Russian war effort in posts online. She's been fined 50,000 rubles, which is worth just over £675. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to Darren.
Very good afternoon and welcome to the programme. It is 7 minutes past 3 o'clock on this Thursday. Thursday is Thursday, isn't it? Thursday afternoon. You're watching GB News on TV, online and maybe listening as well on the radio. Thank you very much indeed for your company. Well, let's start off again with the Conservative leadership race, because who is going to succeed Boris Johnson as Prime Minister? We've got a couple more weeks, almost a month, to decide who that will be, but it will be between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss as they continue to clash over tax and spend plans. Liz Truss today committed to a £43 billion high-speed railway through the Red Wall, saying she would build the Northern Powerhouse Rail in full, marking a major change on Boris Johnson's approach so far with a programme of upgrades. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak is still in defence over his U-turn on VAT and energy bills, but also suggesting that he will not build any new homes on the Green Belt. Well, let's bring in one of Rishi Sunak's supporters. That's the Environment Secretary, George Eustice, who joined us live from Westminster this afternoon. George, good afternoon to you. Would you accept that Rishi Sunak is behind in this campaign, that he is, at this stage at least, somewhat the underdog?
Well, if you look at the polls, then yes, they do suggest that Liz Truss is ahead at the moment. But, you know, for me, that doesn't really matter. For me, I've worked with both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak in Cabinet for over 2 years now. I've got a good sense, I think, of who would be the best Prime Minister. And that's why I'm backing Rishi Sunak. I think he's got good judgment. We've got very difficult challenges ahead, particularly on the financial side as we emerge from the pandemic. I think he's shown good financial acumen, and we need that good judgment in our Prime Minister over the next 2 years, and that's why we should be supporting him.
So what does he need to do here, George, if you recognise that he is behind in the polls? He was behind in the polls 2 weeks ago, before that Channel 4 debate. We've had many debates since. We've got another one in Leeds tonight, the first hustings among the Conservative membership. What does he need to do tonight to change those poll numbers? Because clearly at the moment, his strategy isn't working, is it?
Well, only if you believe the polls. And of course, with any poll, there's only one poll that really matters, and that's once those 160,000 or so Conservative members cast their votes in the main ballot. Polls are an indication of what may or may not be happening. I think Rishi Sunak, in all of these leadership debates, has shown that he's got good judgment. He's shown that he's got a real command of the detail on every single front. That's why I'm backing him. But, you know, always in a leadership contest like this, you will get candidates like Liz Truss who will say things that appeal to members at some times. And, you know, our members are also quite capable when it comes to the moment to set aside what people are saying and make an important judgment about who would be the best Prime Minister. And I think they will do that, and I very much hope they do. And if they do, I think they'll elect Rishi Sunak as our next party leader.
Well, let's look at some of those policies. Today, the former Chancellor saying he will not build new houses on the Green Belt at all. We've got a housing crisis in this country. We've had one for many years. We've not built enough houses for many years. How is that a sensible policy? In the end, it appears like desperation to shore up his support. It's not in the national interest, is it?
Well, it is, because the Green Belt's been protected for decades. There are many brownfield sites in our urban areas that we could actually be developing and should be developing before going on to greenfield sites. But the Green Belt, of course, itself is a very specific area around outer London. There are other parts of the country where you would still be able to build. But I think it is important as a country that we challenge ourselves to try to develop some of those brownfield sites before opting for greenfield sites. Yes, they're often more difficult. Yes, sometimes you've got issues around land remediation or contaminated land. Yes, it can cost a bit more, but it's worth going the extra mile because you both deal with problems of dereliction, which is a very bad blight on many of our urban areas, but you also make sure you get the housing that you need.
But Mr. Eustace, isn't that the problem, though, with Rishi Sunak's campaign? We've got a housing crisis in this country. We've had a housing crisis for quite a long time. His solution is to build on brownfield sites. Building on brownfield sites is a bit like when governments say that they're going to cut public spending by simply finding inefficiencies in government. It's not exactly radical, is it? It's not exactly going to change the landscape building on some brownfield sites. The governments have been committed to doing for decades, yet we still have a housing crisis.
Well, when you do housing developments, you've got to do it with communities and not do it to communities. And I think that's what many people in this country feel at the moment, is there's pressure to do unsustainable house building. We get these sort of identikit housing developments popping up outside towns, vast developments, often without the infrastructure to go with them, often stranded and detached from the communities that they should be part of. Often in a way that's not aesthetically beautiful by way of the architecture, and not built to last and not good for the environment. So we've got to change our approach so that, yes, we allow houses to be built, but that we build things that are beautiful, that are built to last, and that also protect our environment. And that, I think, is what Rishi Sunak's been setting out today.
OK, just two more questions quickly, if I can, on your brief as Secretary of State for DEFRA. You are stood on College Green, or Abington Green. It's anything but green at the moment. In fact, it looks almost like the same colour as the Houses of Parliament behind you. How concerned should we be about the prospect of a drought this summer, given how little rainfall, particularly in southern England, there has been so far this year?
Well, obviously, we keep the situation under review, but it's important to know that this has principally been a heat wave that's caused huge impacts, and as you say, grass you can see right around the country has dried out as a result of that. But we had reasonable rainfall over the winter period and the spring period, which means most of the reservoirs were reasonably full. So at the moment we don't judge that there is a risk of drought because those reservoirs were replenished quite well over the winter months. But obviously we keep a close eye on this, and we will want to see some rain quite soon.
And just finally on fracking, we heard from both the candidates the other night saying that they support fracking as long as it's got the consent of local communities. Is that essentially the official position of the Conservative government as we stand? I mean, given the fact we've got an energy crisis, given the fact we've got bills expected to hit maybe £3,500 by the end of the year, why are we holding back on this? Shouldn't we start looking at this now to try and help our energy needs?
Well, the important thing is that even as we strive towards net zero, and even before this crisis, there was going to be a very important role for gas during that transition, what they call transition gas. And that's because you need gas to create the blue hydrogen that's going to be a key stepping stone to net zero. And if you're going to need gas, you might as well have your own gas rather than be dependent on imported gas from other countries, some of whom, as we've seen in recent months, are not reliable enough for us to be importing our energy needs from them. And that's why it is right that we do look again at fracking. We suspended it and had a moratorium on it a few years ago because there were some impacts, particularly with earth tremors and so on. We need to make sure we can resolve those sorts of issues before resuming. And it's also the case that shale gas is of a lower quality than, say, North Sea gas. So the preference would still be to continue to exploit our North Sea gas reserves first. But it is something that we should be looking at because we will need gas in that transition to net zero.
OK, George Eustace, as always, thank you so much indeed for joining us. That's George Eustace, the Secretary of State for
Thank you very much.
The Environment, and also backing Rishi Sunak in this campaign. Let's speak to our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, who is in the studio with me this afternoon. Tom, it comes back to that first question I almost posed of George Eustice. Sorry, I did. About what does Rishi Sunak need to do tonight to change the dial? Because to date, despite seems changing policy to a large degree, despite those debates, frankly, the dial has not been changed in his direction.
No, although the caveat must be added that since Rishi Sunak U-turned on that VAT pledge, saying that he would, after all, cut taxes after weeks and weeks of saying it would be irresponsible to do so, we haven't seen a single poll of Conservative Party members since Tuesday evening. So perhaps things have shifted. I think it is rather unlikely, though, given the state of play and given the new endorsements that Liz Truss has attracted over the last 24 hours. Michelle Donnellan, someone who was previously backing Penny Mordaunt, and of course Jake Berry, the chair, who runs the Northern Powerhouse caucus within the Conservative Parliamentary Party. Those two endorsements suggest that there is a general feeling that this is becoming more of an inevitability for Liz Truss. Rishi Sunak really does need to do something enormous to change the conversation. Now, to some extent, his announcement this morning on housing policy might be that. It's got a lot of people worked up, particularly younger Conservatives are turning away from Rishi Sunak, but we know that the membership is mainly made up of older Conservatives, perhaps people who already own their own homes, and perhaps that is exactly the kind of row that Rishi Sunak might want to have, because we know in the past Liz Truss has been on record in terms of saying that she wants more house building. In fact, about 3 or 4 years ago, she explicitly said 1 million homes could be built on the Greenbelt. Now, in fairness to her, she said could, in reference to an Adam Smith Institute report about 3% of the Greenbelt being eased up near train stations. She wasn't saying that that should necessarily happen, but clearly had been flirting with the idea, if there is this division that Rishi Sunak can create on housing, potentially that's the rather destructive argument that might change things for him. That certainly appears to be a calculation of his team at this stage. However, it does look a little bit unedifying.
Really interesting also, isn't it, how in some ways narrow this leadership debate's been so far and the topics that they've covered. It has focused, and maybe understandably so, an awful lot around the cost of living crisis and the economy and taxation. But questions like immigration haven't come up an awful lot. Actually, questions like beyond that, kind of about housing until today, haven't really come up in the debate form. Some of the other big challenges facing Britain. Are we likely to see that change somewhat, potentially this evening? Because these are actually Conservative members officially organised by the Conservative Party.
Yes, so this is the first of 12 regional hustings that are going to take place in every region of the United Kingdom, organised by the Conservative Party, attended by paying Conservative Party members. Not just paying through their membership fees, but actually paying for these events as well. So potentially the Conservative Party will want it to be less about the personalities. They might well steer the conversation more towards policy. And whilst the big disagreements haven't been so far on those other areas of policy, we have seen a lot of policies put forward. Liz Truss came forward with a plan on crime. They've both come forward with statements on China, policy indeed.
On rail today, on
the Rwanda scheme, on rail, on all these sorts of things. But I think probably one of the big reasons why this hasn't turned into a big debate, particularly on immigration or on China, is that now, despite what the past positions may have been, there isn't that much difference between the candidates on these things other than the big issue of tax. And I suppose one of those other issues today, Northern Powerhouse Rail, the reason why Jake Berry is now supporting Liz Truss, she's explicitly committed to building that. Rishi Sunak has said he'd look at building that, but hasn't explicitly committed to it.
We'll be watching later on tonight in Leeds. Tom, thank you very much indeed. Tom Harwood, our political correspondent, live in the studio. Well, let's turn to the Labour Party now, because union and senior figures on Labour's left have reacted angrily to the sacking of the Shadow Transport Minister, who joined striking rail workers on a picket line yesterday. The Ilford South MP, Sam Tarry, as you can see on screen, attended the protest at London's Euston Station on Wednesday, despite Sir Keir Starmer telling French MPs to stay away. Labour said that the reason he was fired was for unauthorised media appearances. Well, Mr Tarry said he's been standing in solidarity with striking workers. Speaking to reporters earlier, Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was questioned on this. Let's have a listen in.
Sam Tarry was sacked because he booked himself onto media programmes without permission and then made up policy on the hoof. And that can't be tolerated in any organisation because we've got collective responsibility. So that was relatively straightforward. Of course, so far as the industrial action is concerned, I completely understand the frustration of so many working people who've seen the prices go up, seen inflation through the roof, and their wages haven't gone up. So the Labour Party will always be on the side of working people, but we need collective responsibility, as any organisation does. I think in any organisation, certainly any political party, everybody understands that if you're on the front bench, you can't book yourself onto media programmes without permission, and you can't make up policy on the hoof. I think that's very straightforward in political parties. I think that's pretty straightforward for any organisation or any business. And so we've got collective responsibility, and that's what that's about. Obviously, the Labour Party's relationship with the trade unions is historic.
That was Sir Keir Starmer speaking earlier. Let's bring in Graham Stringer, Labour MP, who joins us down the line. Graham, was Keir right to sack Sam Tarry?
One of the great things about being a backbencher, and there are disadvantages as well as advantages, is I don't have to ask anybody when I come on your programme or anybody else's programme. The price you pay for being on the front bench is basically you have to toe pretty exactly the shadow cabinet's line on policy and when you speak as opposed to somebody else speaking. If what Keir says is right, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, then Sam has gone beyond those guidelines, and that is a sacking offence. You'd have to ask Sam why he chose, when those are the rules, to get himself sacked.
In saying that, what would you say to people who feel that Keir Starmer somewhat became Labour leader, you know, promising to stick by a relatively Corbynista agenda, got into power or got into the leadership and has abandoned that on things like the nationalisation of the railways, and those people feel conned almost by his leadership?
I feel very disappointed by that change in policy, and I think I certainly, as a Labour MP, will try to change that back. The Labour Party is and should be in favour of public ownership. I can see that it is very expensive to bring back into public ownership, say, the water companies, which I would very much like to. The thing about the railways is Network Rail is already in public ownership, and the train operating companies operate on a franchise. So it's very relatively inexpensive, in fact it'd probably save money, to bring the whole of the rail system back into public ownership. So I think we should continue to pursue that policy, and I think it's been a mistake to cover the railways in what looks like a blanket shadow treasury operation to say we can't afford it. We can afford it.
And also at the same time, Graham, also, isn't it a little odd for the Labour Party, a party who's founded on trade unions, not to stick up for rail workers? Surely if MPs or indeed frontbenchers want to join the picket lines, they should be allowed to. That's the point of the Labour Party, isn't it?
I certainly support the rail workers in trying to protect their living standards in terms of
So isn't
conditions.
what I'm trying to get at, though, isn't Keir Starmer out of step in all of this? This is what I'm trying to ultimately get at.
What he's doing, and I think people understand this, Keir Starmer wants to be the next government, and I want him to be the next Prime Minister, and I want the shadow cabinet to become the cabinet. If you imagine a strike, as there are strikes against Labour governments as well as Conservative governments, and you are the authority owning a large percentage or all of the railways, then it would be a very strange decision for a minister as opposed to a shadow minister to go on a picket line. So supporting verbally without the visuals of being on the picket line, I understand where Keir's coming from. But Labour MPs are always going to join workers who are fighting for their rights and pay, whether it's on picket lines or rallies or wherever.
OK, Graham Stringer, as always, appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed, Labour's Graham Stringer there, joining us down the line from Manchester this afternoon. We're going to take a quick break here on GB News and The Briefing. We'll be back in literally just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
Now, UK defence officials are saying that a Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson is gathering pace, with a key bridge in the southern city of Ukraine being essentially taken out of action by Ukrainian forces who have struck it with those long-range rockets that you can see on your TV. Well, Kherson was one of the first cities to be taken by Russian forces earlier on in the invasion and is now virtually cut off from other occupied territories. Well, delighted to say to join me in the studio is the Ukrainian Member of Parliament, Kira Ruddock, who's been on the programme many times down the line from Ukraine, but is here with us in London this afternoon. Kira, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just talk about this counter-offensive, because it could be quite significant. This was the first city, wasn't it, to fall to the Russians, and the Ukrainians are attempting to take it back.
It is indeed significant, and it's our main aim right now. We started receiving NATO-grade weapons, and we are showing the whole world how effective our army could be when we have enough of weapons and resources. So I do really hope that by the beginning of winter, and we all know that it will be incredibly complicated winter, we will be able to take Kherson back. That will be crucial to show the world our resolve to take back our territories and not to allow Russia to do this referendum there. Because we know that this is what they are planning. They are launching counterattacks on the east of the country, but now our concentration is to get the city in the south.
Really, really interesting, isn't it? And it's good to see that some of the weapons, I think, supplied by the UK and others seem to be making a difference. Is there a sense, though, and you've been to the UK many times, haven't you, over the last couple of months, that the attention of the Western world on Ukraine is not quite as great as it was back in February or March time. Is that concerning that people seem to be focusing on gas prices and the cost of living crisis rather than necessarily on the war in Ukraine?
But gas prices and cost of living prices, they are directly linked to Ukraine. And of course, there is no such emotion that was at the very beginning, but now it is more of a pragmatic support that the governments and parliaments know that they have to provide to Ukraine because we are basically fighting as a shield. Look, even imagine that there is no Ukraine. Do you think that Putin will become a nicer person overnight and the gas prices will go down? I don't think so. Do you think that with Ukrainian ports being blocked, the grain prices will change? And so the questions and the fights that we are fighting right now on our land are actually the answer to so many of the issues that people of the whole world are experiencing right now. The cost of a biscuit here in the United Kingdom is directly linked to the question, are we going to be able to export the grains or not? The cost of the amount that you see on the energy bill is directly linked to the question, are the sanctions going to be actually working and weakening Putin down or not?
Change things at all. And just what of things like in Ukraine? We know tens of thousands of people have sadly lost their lives. Millions of people have been displaced. But some people have returned home from having fled the early couple of months. What is life like? Ukraine's a big country. But what is life like for lots of ordinary Ukrainians today?
Sometimes you can forget that there is war and you can imagine and pretend that things are okay. You can drink coffee with your friend or you can have a dinner with your family, but then suddenly it is interrupted by air raid sirens and everybody have to go to hide. And this is so terrifying because this is Putin's aim to make sure that we do not feel safe anywhere in our country. And this is true, we do not feel safe anywhere. Because you see, like overnight, tonight, there were like 25 different rocket attacks to different areas of Ukraine. This happened because today is a date of christening of the Kievan Rus. And as we know, for tyrannies and for Putin as a tyrant, it's always a matter of pride to attack on some significant date. So this is what he has done. But every time you hope that you get to some normality, it is always interrupted by something. And you know, right now, after 5.5 months of war, every Ukrainian family has either been to a funeral or have received a coffin. And we do not forget about it because people whom you loved, people whom you've seen, people whom you know are actually dying at the front and not coming back.
Yeah, it's very sad indeed. Kira, we really appreciate you coming in today. Thank you very much indeed, Kira Ruddock there.
Thank you.
Ukrainian Member of Parliament joining us here in the studio. Thank you very much indeed. OK, you're watching GB News. Lots more between now and 4 o'clock, including nuclear security, and we'll be in Birmingham for the Commonwealth Games. But first, let's bring you up to date with the very latest news headlines just after 3:30.
Darren, thank you. It's just coming up to 3:34. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB Newsroom. Judge Sarah Munro QC has made legal history in the first ever broadcasting of a criminal trial sentencing. Her comments were publicly screened from the Old Bailey in a manslaughter case. She sentenced Ben Oliver to life in prison with a minimum of 10 years after he pleaded guilty to killing his grandfather in South London. The battle for the keys to number 10 hots up tonight as the leadership candidates go head-to-head in Leeds. Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss are taking part in the first of 12 Tory hustings. Tax and spending are expected to be the big battlegrounds as they tour the country, hoping to secure party members' votes ahead of the ballot closing on September the 2nd. The NHS is closing its only gender identity clinic for children and young people and replacing it with a regional network. It's after it was told that only having one provider is not a safe or viable long-term option. The contract for the Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust will be brought to a close. And holidaymakers are facing 2-hour queues at the port of Dover amid warnings this weekend will see long delays. Check-in and border control for cross-channel crossings are once again suffering delays and disruption. It's after tens of thousands of families waited up to 6 hours at Dover last weekend. The 22nd Commonwealth Games will start in Birmingham tonight. The opening ceremony, which begins at 8 p.m. at the Alexander Stadium, will be attended by the Prince of Wales. Tom Daley is among those carrying the Queen's baton to kick off the Games. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Darren will be back in just a moment.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
A quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.212 and 1.194 euros. And the price of gold currently stands at £1,445, 19 pence per ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We're trying to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Very welcome back. It is coming up to 21 minutes to 4 o'clock on this Thursday afternoon. You're watching the GB News Briefing with me, Darren McCaffrey. We're on TV, online and on your radio as well. Thank you very much indeed for your company. Do get in touch, by the way, gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews, particularly if you've got an opinion on the race for number 10, because we're going to talk about that now again. Spoke to George Eustace, the Environment Secretary, who's backing Rishi Sunak a little earlier in the programme. Well, delighted to say we're now joined by the Conservative MP, Anne-Marie Morris, who's backing Liz Truss on the campaign. We are all about balance here on GB News. Anne-Marie, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And we had an announcement, didn't we, from Liz Truss today about fulfilling that pledge on Northern Rail.
I think the key thing about Liz is she's very clear when there are policies that we need to push forwards. This has been on the agenda for a very long time, and the historic plan was very much a bit here and a bit there, and it wasn't a cohesive, joined-up route. And I think certainly talking to some of my northern colleagues, this is the right thing to do. So while it seems like an eye-watering amount, if it delivers, as I understand it will, the supercharging to the northern economy, then it seems to me it's the right thing to do. But at least she's clear, she's a gutsy lady, and she's going to get on with it.
Indeed, but isn't the problem is that she's going to be spending an awful lot of money? We've got tax cuts, removal of green levies, now this pledge on Northern Rail. I think one stage she'd also committed herself to, I mean, we're talking about tens and tens of billions of pounds when you add it all together. Can we afford it all?
Okay, so first of all, I would say there are many tens of billions headroom as a result of the tax take that we have so far. Because remember, tax is very much because it's a percentage. If there is more to levy tax on, then the tax take is inevitably more. So I think first of all there is that headroom, and that is something that we should not forget. Secondly, we have to look at what is the strategy to get out of this, and the key is growth. How do you get growth? You get growth by incentivizing investment in the private sector. And so what Liz is trying to do is she's trying to say to private sector, we recognise you are the solution. We recognise this is where we need the growth, because we can only grow our way out of that. And this is why she is making all of these pledges, promises, why she is changing the tax regime, which was established under Boris and Rishi. So that's the driver. And yes, I accept there will have to be an element of borrowing. But at the end of the day, if we simply carry on taxing and increasing tax at the rate scheduled, then we will land up in a downward spiral and go into recession, frankly, in a way that we don't need to.
Or we could go in the opposite direction, of course, of a spiral in regards to inflation. On that point, when we look at the cost of living crisis, reports today suggesting that energy prices could go up to 3,000, 3,500 on average for your family later on this year with that energy price cap. Could be 500 quid a month by January. Is there an acceptance in the kind of Liz Truss camp that actually those tax cuts will be enough to help people out during this cost of living crisis? Or is she prepared to go even further in trying to help people this winter?
Okay, so let's address the cost of living crisis first, and then we'll deal with inflation. So the cost of living crisis is driven by external events, which we can not stop, we can mitigate. But the critical thing is to try to make sure we do what we can to give people more in their pockets so they can decide how to spend it. And I think Liz's approach, which is a much more conservative approach, is let's try and ensure people have more in their pocket, in their take-home pay, so that they can decide and manage their budget accordingly, which is different to, if you like, the Rishi school of thought and the Boris school of thought, which is very much, it's going up. We're not going to give you the choice. What we're going to do is give you effectively a subsidy, and we might actually claw that back later. I don't think that has been very well received. Certainly, all the constituents I've spoken to have not found that to be a very effective way forward. Now, in terms of your question about interest rates, here we have to get a balance. One of the things I would say is that not every tax change gives rise to a necessary rise in interest rates or inflation. So I think we need to be clear that we don't say one necessarily drives the other. The second thing I would say is that we have had historically low levels of interest rate, and while we've enjoyed that over the last X years, it's actually been an abnormal position. And I think what Liz is trying to look at is, if we're going to incentivise growth and saving and investment, then if business and indeed individuals, particularly those on fixed incomes, don't have an incentive to do that, then we're not going to be able to grow ourselves out of this particular problem. So while, of course, we do not want a rise in inflation, and that's about managing which taxes you cut, some will be inflationary, some won't. On interest rates, we have to get a balance. So we need to make sure that those who can and want to save and businesses that want to invest can, and there is a return for doing that, because that is the way out of this problem.
OK, well, we will see, and this will be debated again tonight and in the days and weeks to come. Anne-Marie Morris, thank you. Joining us live there from Devon, supporting Liz Truss. Thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon. OK, let's move to Birmingham now, because it is all set for today's opening ceremony of the Commonwealth Games, which over the next 12 days will welcome 72 teams and around 6,500 athletes and officials to compete in the biggest sporting programme in the Commonwealth Games' history. Delighted to say that our reporter Will Hollis is in Birmingham for us this afternoon, and I'm sure the excitement is palpable, Will.
Good afternoon. Yeah, this square here where we are, Victoria Square, it's been gradually filling up over the last few hours. Lots of people here celebrating, lots of children running around playing different games, lots of people dancing, and of course lots of people walking around in their Commonwealth tracksuit, because 72 different nations and territories from around the world, so those big nations like Australia, New Zealand and Canada, as well as Caribbean islands and South Pacific islands that are really small nations of only a few thousand populations, they're all here today to open the games that's going to be starting at Alexander Stadium around 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock tonight. But then for 10 days afterwards, they're going to be competing in things like athletics, lawn bowls, as well as disability sports. This is the first time it's a fully integrated Paralympic sporting event for the Commonwealth. So it's really bringing people together under that banner of unity and pride underneath the Commonwealth. Now, what's quite interesting as well is in the news today, Liz Truss, who's obviously a leadership candidate for the job of being Prime Minister of this country, she's been talking about the Commonwealth and how we need to create closer ties to it in a post-Brexit period, particularly to reduce the influence of China. Billions of pounds is being pumped into developing nations, Commonwealth nations in Asia as well as in Africa as part of the Belt and Road investment infrastructure in business and economies, and it's creating a dependency in some aspects on China and these bigger nations. So Liz Truss, one of the campaign pledges that she's saying is that a global Britain needs to become closer tied to its Commonwealth neighbours. Rishi Sunak is probably going to say something similar in terms of trade, but it seems to be that Liz Truss has caught onto those headlines today in a really strong way. It's something that I'm sure we're going to see a little bit more of as we see the hustings later today. But where we are right now in the middle of Victoria Square, people aren't really interested in the politics of what might be happening in the future of Britain. People are really just interested in celebrating the start of this Commonwealth Games, the 22nd Commonwealth Games in the year 2022 here in Birmingham.
All kicks off tonight and over the next 12 days. Will, thank you very much indeed. Will Hollis there joining us from a pretty lively Birmingham this afternoon. Now, the first televised Crown Court sentencing has heard its first case in history take place in front of cameras today, who've been allowed into the criminal courts for the first time in almost a century. Joining me is our Home Affairs and Security Editor, Mark White, who is outside the Old Bailey this afternoon. Good afternoon, Mark. It was a landmark day in legal history, and indeed broadcasting history too.
Yes, it was a very important day in terms of the move to open justice that the government and the judiciary really want to see happen here. What we're not getting is the full televising of a full trial as we get in America, these court cases which are avidly followed and sometimes sensational in nature. Well, there's no way that the judiciary, the legal profession and those victims advocates would accept that kind of full court televising of trials in this country. So instead it's very limited, a very structured end of the trial process that we got live insight into as the judge passed sentence, so her sentencing remarks, but they were nonetheless very enlightening and extremely important because the judge sets out what happened in the case. In this particular case, it was a tragic case of a 25-year-old man, Ben Oliver, who stabbed to death his bedridden grandfather in their house in South London last January. And this man, very tragic in terms of his background as well, had been the subject of abuse, both physical and sexual, from his stepfather and a neighbour when he was growing up, had gone on to offend prolifically as well. So that was some of the mitigation that the judge took into consideration when passing the sentence, a sentence for manslaughter of life in prison, with a recommendation that he serve at least 10 years in prison before he is eligible for parole. This is what Judge Sarah the judge said in passing that sentence.
The sentence I pass upon you is therefore one of life imprisonment
with a minimum term of 10 years and 8 months. From that term will be deducted the term you have spent on remand, which is 553 days. That deduction results in a term of 9 years and 63 days. Those numbers can be amended administratively if my calculation is incorrect. Once you have served that term, you will be entitled to apply for parole. However, you will not be released by the parole board unless they conclude that you no longer pose a risk to the public.
And the judge there, Sarah Munro, I hope she forgives me for getting her name there, doesn't hold me in contempt. But I think the judiciary will be very pleased with the way in which this first day of televising these sentencing remarks has gone, because as harrowing as the case was, it was for them the perfect example of the very difficult process involved in passing sentence, in determining how long someone should stay behind bars, the complex nature of both the mitigation and the aggravating factors that were so prevalent in this particular case.
Mark, I'm sure she will forgive you indeed. Mark White there, Home Affairs and Security Editor. Thank you very much indeed for joining us outside the Old Bailey this afternoon. OK, let's end on this idea of a nuclear risk from China, because Sir Stephen Lovegrove, who's the UK's National Security Advisor, has warned that an accidental nuclear war with China is a growing risk. He warned that the West must not stumble into uncontrolled conflict with Beijing, and said that Britain had clear concerns that China was expanding and modernising its nuclear arsenal, adding that China's disdain for arms control agreements was a daunting prospect. So, is this a real possibility or slightly alarmist? Let's speak to Hamish Durrett-Gordon, who joins us down the line. Hamish, as always, thank you for joining us. What's your assessment of all of this? At the moment, sat here in London, it seems a little far-fetched, but I'm sure he knows much more than I do.
Well, Darren, I think that's the key thing to start off with. If Stephen Lovegrove is suggesting it's something that we need to be concerned about, then we probably should. He probably has a lot more detail on the security implications than we do, and I think he brings out some very good points. I think not least at all. You know, we have the Russians potentially threatening nuclear use in Ukraine, and when you have China modernising and tripling the size of its nuclear arsenal, that is a concern. I think one of the key points he says is that, at least with the Russians during the Cold War, we had a dialogue. We understood each other's doctrine and the way that we would use nuclear weapons. Therefore, that meant that there were stocks and changes so that actually miscalculations couldn't happen. Now, we don't have that with the Chinese. And as he said also, their disdain for arms control and their sort of malign influence around the country really raises these issues. And again, going back to Ukraine.
No, sorry, Hamish, I was just going to interrupt there and saying, and does that mean, if this is the case, that this is not like the Cold War and that we, don't understand the parameters necessarily well, does that mean we need to change how we react to all of this and the strategies that we might well have in place?
Well, I think we certainly do. And we certainly need to make sure that we have those lines of communication open with the Chinese, so the chance of miscalculation is not there. And with what has happened in Ukraine, and it is well reported that China also has designs on Taiwan, that again raises the stakes. And I think a nuclear-capable China, without the checks and balances in place that we have with the Russians, is not a good place to be. So I think it's a welcome highlight by Stephen Lovegrove. And amongst all the other news that is happening at the moment, we know that China does have malign intent in a whole host of things. It's important that we don't turn a blind eye to this increase in nuclear capability and make sure that ourselves, and particularly the Americans and the French, the other key nuclear nations, have a dialogue with the Chinese to make sure that mistakes and accidents don't happen.
And just very finally and quickly, you've got about 30 seconds, Hamish. The real concern here that we're kind of talking about, but not mentioning, is it Taiwan, essentially?
Well, I think that's a concern. Again, seeing, with Russians' expansion into Ukraine and the unconventional war that they're now developing there, with, again, the possibility, hopefully not, of nuclear use. If China does decide to invade Taiwan. The fact that they are significantly nuclear capable will make it more difficult for the international community, NATO and others, to prevent that happening.
OK, Hamish, to Brendan Gordon, as always, appreciate your time and your analysis this afternoon, live there from Salisbury. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. OK, well, that is it from me on the briefing for this afternoon. Of course, Olling Foster will be back at 3 o'clock, as she is every Friday. Tomorrow, Tom in at 9:30 in the morning for your latest political fix. Up next, though, it is Brazier between 4 and 6 with Mark Longhurst standing in for Colin this afternoon. Stay tuned for that in just a couple of minutes. But I'll leave you this Thursday afternoon with the weather from the Met Office. Have a nice weekend. I'll see you on Monday. Bye-bye.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast. We do have some scattered heavy showers across northern and western parts of the UK over the next 24 hours or so, but there's plenty of bright or sunny spells to come too. And generally the settled weather is down to high pressure, which sits to the east of us at the moment. However, as we end the week and go into the weekend, Atlantic weather systems will start to move in, bringing some stronger winds, outbreaks of rain too. Back to the rest of Thursday, though, fairly cloudy end to the day. The best of the sunshine across southern areas. Some heavy showers across parts of Dumfries and Galloway and across the borders too, but these should start to fade away as we head into the early hours. Some patchy rain across the Pennines too, but elsewhere generally dry and clear skies. Temperatures in the range of 11 to 16 Celsius in the towns and cities, so fairly mild night to come. Best of the sunshine first thing Friday morning will be across central southern parts of England and Wales. Still cloudy across parts of the Pennines up into the borders. Here some patchy outbreaks of rain, but it should tend to fade later on in the morning, though it will be replaced by sunshine and showers into the afternoon. Some of these showers bubbling up across Wales and the Midlands too. Elsewhere, generally dry with sunny spells, temperatures low to mid-20s, highs of 27 Celsius towards the London area, so fairly warm out there tomorrow afternoon. Through the evening, 1 or 2 showers still possible, but these fading away.